The date was December 5, 1933. The time was 5:32 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. In a radio room in Washington, D.C., a telegraph key began to click. It was a sound that millions of Americans had been waiting 13 long, dry, and often violent years to hear. The signal traveled across the wires to waiting newsrooms, speakeasies, and living rooms across the continent. Utah, the 36th state, had just ratified the 21st Amendment. The experiment was over. The 18th Amendment was dead. Prohibition was history. For the first time since 1920, a citizen of the United States could purchase a bottle of whiskey, a glass of wine, or a pint of beer without looking over their shoulder for a federal agent. But the story of how America got its drink back isn't just about alcohol. It is a story of economic desperation, political upheaval, and a nation trying to find a glimmer of light in the darkest years of the Great Depression. This is the story of the race to repeal. This is the story of beer by Christmas. To understand the relief that washed over the country in 1933, we first have to understand the misery that preceded it. By the early 1930s, the noble experiment of prohibition had curdled into a national nightmare. What was intended to improve the moral character of the nation had instead fueled the rise of organized crime. Gangsters like Al Capone had turned the streets of Chicago into war zones. Corruption was rampant in police departments and city halls. But more importantly, the country was broke. The stock market crash of 1929 had decimated the economy. By 1932, unemployment sat at a staggering 25%. Lines for soup kitchens wrapped around city blocks. The federal government was desperate for revenue, but with income taxes plummeting because no one had any income, Washington was running on fumes. It became increasingly difficult for politicians to justify spending millions of dollars enforcing prohibition laws that no one obeyed, while simultaneously ignoring a potential goldmine of tax revenue from legal alcohol sales. The argument shifted. It was no longer just about personal liberty or morality. It was about dollars and cents. It was about jobs. Enter Franklin Delano Roosevelt. In the election of 1932, the contrast between the candidates couldn't have been starker. Herbert Hoover, the incumbent, was seen as rigid and out of touch. He had famously called prohibition an experiment noble in motive, but he offered little solution to the crime and poverty it exacerbated. Roosevelt, on the other hand, sensed the shifting winds. The Democratic platform openly called for the repeal of the 18th Amendment. When Roosevelt won in a landslide, it was a mandate. The people wanted a New Deal, and part of that deal was a cold drink. But repealing a constitutional amendment is incredibly difficult. In the history of the United States, an amendment had never been repealed before. It required a two-thirds vote in both the House and the Senate, followed by ratification by 3/4 of the states. That meant 36 states had to agree. The Dries, the temperance movement leaders, were confident they could block it. They only needed 13 states to say no to keep the country dry forever. Roosevelt didn't want to wait for the slow machinery of the constitutional amendment process to give the people what they wanted. He knew the country needed a morale boost immediately. He also knew the government needed the tax money immediately. So he made a move that would become legendary. On March 13, 1933, just 9 days after his inauguration, Roosevelt sent a short, powerful message to Congress. He urged them to modify the Volstead Act, the law that defined what intoxicating liquor was. During Prohibition, anything with more than 0.5% alcohol was illegal. Roosevelt asked Congress to raise that limit to 3.2% for beer and light wine. His reasoning was clever. He argued that 3.2% beer wasn't really intoxicating. Therefore, the 18th Amendment didn't ban it. It was a loophole, but a loophole the public was desperate to jump through. Congress, eager to please the new president and even more eager for the tax revenue, moved at lightning speed. On March 22, 1933, Roosevelt signed the Cullen-Harrison Act. As he signed the bill, he famously remarked, "I think this would be a good time for a beer." The act was set to go into effect on April 7, 1933. The anticipation was electric. Breweries that had been surviving by making near beer, soda, or ice cream suddenly roared back to life. In St. Louis, the Anheuser-Busch Brewery prepared a team of Clydesdale horses to deliver the first case of legal beer to the White House. On the night of April 6th, thousands of people gathered outside breweries in Milwaukee, St. Louis, and New York. They waited for the clock to strike midnight. When it did, the factory whistles blew. Trucks rolled out. The crowds cheered as if the war had ended. In the first 24 hours, 1.5 million barrels of beer were sold. The government collected millions in taxes in a single day. The psychological shift was immediate. For the first time in years, people felt a sense of normalcy. It wasn't just about the alcohol. It was about the return of personal freedom and the feeling that the government was finally listening to the people. But while the beer flowed in April, the hard liquor, the whiskey, the gin, the rum was still illegal. The 18th Amendment was still in the Constitution. The Cullen-Harrison Act was just a stopgap. The real battle was for full repeal. Throughout the summer and autumn of 1933, a unique political process unfolded. The Constitution specifies that amendments can be ratified by state legislatures or by state ratifying conventions. Congress, fearing that state legislatures were too gerrymandered and beholden to the temperance lobby, chose the convention method for the first and only time in history. This meant the people voted for delegates, who would then vote on repeal. It was the purest form of democracy the country had seen in years. State by state, the dominoes fell. Michigan was the first to ratify in April. Then Wisconsin, Rhode Island, Wyoming. The momentum was unstoppable. The Dries were stunned. They had expected a fight in the rural South and the Midwest, but even those regions were voting wet. The economic argument was simply too strong to ignore. As winter approached, the count ticked upward. By early November, 33 states had ratified. They needed 3 more. The target was December 5th. 3 states were scheduled to hold their conventions that day: Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Utah. Pennsylvania and Ohio were considered sure bets. But Utah was a wild card. The Mormon Church, which dominated the state's culture, was strictly opposed to alcohol. The president of the church had urged members to vote against repeal. It seemed like the perfect place for the Dries to make their last stand. However, the Great Depression didn't care about religious preferences. Utah was suffering just as much as New York. The people of Salt Lake City wanted the jobs and the revenue that repeal promised. On the morning of December 5th, Pennsylvania ratified. The count was 34. In the early afternoon, Ohio ratified. The count was 35. All eyes turned to Salt Lake City. The drama was high. The convention hall was packed. But despite the church's opposition, the delegates had been elected on a wet platform. At 3:32 p.m. local time, the president of the Utah Convention, Ray Olson, banged his gavel. The vote was unanimous. Utah had put the final nail in the coffin of Prohibition. Back in Washington, President Roosevelt signed the official proclamation. The 21st Amendment was ratified. The 18th Amendment was repealed. The reaction was instantaneous. In New York City, the Waldorf Astoria Hotel had 500 cases of champagne on ice, ready for the moment the news broke. Restaurants that had been pretending to serve only coffee and sandwiches suddenly produced wine lists. The grim speakeasies, with their secret knocks and watered-down liquor, threw open their doors or legitimized their businesses. It wasn't chaos, though. Many feared that the streets would be filled with debauchery, but reports from the next day noted that the celebrations were largely joyous and civilized. It was a release of tension. It was a toast to the future. The "Beer by Christmas" slogan that had floated around earlier in the year had been exceeded. The American people had beer by Easter, and by Christmas, they had the full bar. The legacy of that year is still with us. The 21st Amendment did more than just bring back alcohol. It fundamentally changed how alcohol is regulated. It gave the power to the states. That is why today we have such a patchwork of liquor laws across the country. Why you can buy whiskey in a grocery store in one state but have to go to a state-run dispensary in another. It was a compromise that allowed the dry regions to remain dry if they chose, while the wet regions could indulge. But the most immediate impact was on the national mood. 1933 was a hard year. The Depression would drag on for several more years. The clouds of war were beginning to gather in Europe. But for that one holiday season in December of 1933, the glasses were raised high. The end of Prohibition didn't solve all of America's problems. It didn't end the Depression overnight, and it certainly didn't end organized crime, which simply pivoted to other illicit activities. But it did prove something vital about the American democracy: that the Constitution is a living document capable of correcting its own mistakes. It proved that a law that lacks the consent of the governed cannot stand. So the next time you crack open a cold beer or pour a glass of wine to celebrate a holiday, take a moment to remember December 1933. Remember the 13 years of silence, the bootleggers, the speakeasies, and the long, hard fight to bring the bottle back to the table. It was the year America admitted it was wrong, corrected its course, and gave itself a much-needed drink. And as FDR might have said, raising a glass to the weary nation. Happy days are here again.